Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video, I wanted to talk about fictional characters that I've always felt I could personally relate to. I was having a discussion recently with a longtime friend who I've met through YouTube, and have gone back and forth having many discussions over different anime series and properties and characters, and we got onto the topic of characters that inspire us or we feel very much like and things along those lines. And it got me thinking of the more broader picture of characters not only relating to like anime but television shows and movies and such, and literature that I am constantly drawn back to, and probably because I see parts of myself resonating within those characters. Not all told, it's almost like cutting up your personality into little leaflets, into, different sections, and certain of these characters represent different equivalents to those things. And so I thought I'd put it out there and explore this sort of concept of what might draw us to entertainment and certain things, and going back to those things time and time again with these characters that are just highly relatable to us or that we greatly admire and are an example to us and such like that. And to kind of get the ball rolling, I figured I'd start with Cowboy Bebop's Spike Spiegel. He is very much somebody who can be admired in his physical prowess. He can do taekwondo and all these martial arts moves and everything like that. But what I feel I most sort of resemble in his character and relate to is his sort of, very much not concerning himself with things that don't immediately affect him. Basically, he's very much unconcerned. There's a line, one of my favorite quotes is, "Whatever happens, happens. There's not really much I can do about it. I can only sort of answer to whatever unfolds and try to get myself out of it if it's a precarious situation or whatever." Mostly he's sort of tunnel vision on money and food. Whatever will put, money in his wallet and food in his belly is a good equation for him, and everything else, it just doesn't matter. Anything that doesn't affect him, as far as not being unsympathetic. And, I'm somebody who has a large part of my mentality which is very empathetic, and, character like Superman is another character where I have always admired his selflessness, his nobility, his honor, his self-sacrifice, willingness to self-sacrifice, and being there for others. And I've always tried to emulate that within my own life. Try to be there for others who might, have been caused pain or are suffering pain much like I have in my own life, and just to let them know that somebody out there cares, and to try to pick up some of the weight that they might be impacted by. And whereas Spike is a character that he's not concerned with that kind of stuff, but I see it more as like not concerning myself and obsessing over things that would just bring down my mood. I don't try to let myself get depressive that often. It still happens. I mean, there are times where I'm very much in a down mood and such like that, but more often than not, I just try to sort of embrace a mild level of apathy that Spike very much embodies, and that isn't to say, as I note, that it's not a level of turning off empathy and not putting yourself into other people's shoes so that you would feel necessarily unconcerned with how they're doing and such like that, but just not concerning yourself or overly obsessing on things that are needless, that are just going to cause you more harm than good and waste your time and everything like that. As I said, speaking of Superman, there are multiple levels of the Superman character that I feel very much my own personality resonates toward. Definitely in the inspiration and aspiration of wanting to be selfless and be there for others and do good and that kind of thing. But there are also aspects in certain, incarnations of the character of Superman, Clark Kent, as a young man, trying to find himself and find his place in the world in different depictions, and feeling very much like an outsider and like an alien, and then fearful of what the world would do in reaction to his sort of finally exposing himself, if you will, for the powers and the abilities and those things that he has at his command. And very much like the character of Mr. Spock from the original series of Star Trek, those two characters, those two aspects, I've always, a lot in my life, felt like an outsider, like an outcast. I've always sort of traveled to the beat of my own drum, as the phrase goes, and there have been times where I've looked at the world at large and I've been disappointed by it, and I've been you know, downtrodden because of those things. Like, I just don't fit in here. I don't feel like I'm a part of this species because I have this different outlook on how humans should behave that goes against its antithesis of what, you know, human behavior naturally is in the negative and everything like that. Whereas I want to live my life more positive and more positively affecting toward others. And so there has been times where, like, the outcast alien like Spock, like a young Superman before he finds his footing and his courage and being able to embrace, you know, what his world, what this adopted world represents. There's a level of that that I've always felt in the back of my mind. Of course, I look at humanity at large, and there are times when I can be very disappointed with it. Two characters that very strongly resonate with me are from two, you know, 1960s, 50s, and 60s movies, sci-fi classics. One is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the character of Captain Nemo. This is the Disney Kirk Douglas, you know, movie, as well as the time traveler, or George, in the George Pal 1960s Time Machine, you know, based on the original novel, which is my favorite novel of all time by H.G. Wells. And the character was actually, whereas in the novel he's just called the Traveler, in the film they called him Herbert George Wells, you know, as an honor to the original author. But both of these characters, you know, with Nemo, he very much saw a world where slavery was the thing. You know, prisoners were put to work in sweltering heat, hundreds of degrees, and you know, backbreaking labor. And not just prisoners, but there was slave culture all around the world. There was war. There was all these things. The mechanics of destruction, and science was being utilized for that. And that's a very strong parallel between that character and the Traveler, as depicted in the film The Time Machine, who is also a man of science. He's an inventor, much like Nemo was. And whereas Nemo created the Nautilus to go under the sea and escape the world above, the Traveler sought to create something that could, you know, move him beyond the fourth dimension of time. And he wanted to sort of rest on the idea that the future must be more beneficial than the now. Both of these men were very sort of disconcerted by the times they were living in and all of the negative that was surrounding them. With the Traveler was the First World War, and seeing soldiers put to death, seeing science creating new weaponizations from tanks to, you know, bombs and this, that, and the other thing. And so both of these characters very much wanted to escape the world because of all its faults and its negatives. And, you know, I've always felt strongly sort of the resonating feel of that, the vibe of that. Looking at the world around me, looking at the terrorism and looking at the constant threats and how human beings can be so self-destructive and destructive toward others and very harmful. And so these are two characters that have always strongly resonated with me, because there have been many a time where I'm sitting back and I'm thinking, I just wish I could escape. I don't fit into this world, and I wish I could escape this world the way it is. And when you look at a character like Motoko Kusanagi, who is my utmost, topmost favorite all-time anime or any sort of fictional medium character, but more specifically, I'm pointing toward the anime series Ghost in the Shell standalone complex rather than the films and such, where her character, they have a lot more time to sort of delve into what makes her character tick. And a lot of that is, you know, the sort of same things we all go through in life. What is life? What is the soul? What makes the form and function of humanity? When you introduce cybernetics and that kind of thing, the idea of the soul being implanted as almost a computer algorithm into cybernetic, you know, a cybernetic brain and chassis and all these things, you start to become existential with your philosophizing and, you know, looking at the metaphysical and all these things. And she's very much trying to understand the world around her while also being a just kick-ass babe, you know, effectively. But it was all those soul-searching aspects, you know, clinging to, in the case of her character toward the end of the first season of the show, she has a watch as her sort of, you know, syndicate or whatever you want to call it, unit, Section 9, has come under false, accusatory claims and everything, and they're being shut down, threatened to be shut down, all of them being threatened to be killed or incarcerated, and they kind of have to, figure out who's behind it and reveal them so they can reclaim their own well-being, if you will. But she has an attachment, even though her body is fully cyberized. She's kind of chastised by, a partner in the group, Section 9, Bato. Why are you carrying around this watch, this, physical tie to a world that is so far beyond what you are now? It relates to her past, effectively. And the idea of human beings accumulating artifacts and items, and look at my room, all behind me, posters, action figures, DVDs. I'm a collector by nature, and I collect the things that, speak to me and inspire me and instill me with entertainment or joy or whatever, whatever my fixation is. All of these things that I surround myself with are an extension of what makes me feel good in life. And in a sense, it's also recapturing the nostalgia of old and the memory of old. And that's what her character always represented to me, not just the soul searching, but also trying to understand what makes me who I am, and what is it that I surround myself with? Why do I surround myself with these aspects of things that fuel me, that keep me propelling forward, ever forward, and the introspective nature of that character, of all of these characters. A more recent character, as you can see from this little wall scroll, is Tomoko Kuroki from the anime series Watamote. And she's very much reclusive. She's, in sort of high school in the series, and she's been there for several months, and she's alone. She hasn't been able to sort of break beyond her own self-imposed fear and self-conscious nature of being able to bridge the gap and talk to others and, interact with people and everything like that. And those are aspects I could relate to from back when I was in school. I was very much as much an outcast as I, related to earlier, like the Spock character, who's this alien looking at the world from the outside. Like, I just don't know how to fit into that. Weighing his emotions and trying to figure out how to gauge and conduct himself around these people who are so very different, seemingly, from him. And yet the underlying thing is, of course, we're all the same. But for the Tomoko character, it's in the extreme, to the point where she tries and she wants to break free of, she's even pervy in nature because she isn't used to social convention. And whereas I was, there were still stumbling blocks along the way of figuring out how to behave around others and finding a level of confidence. And she goes through some of the worst, trial and error, trials and tribulations that any character ever would have gone through, to the point where you're almost just feeling so bad for her. I've heard people not being able to get through the entirety of that anime series because it's so just hurtful and, reflective on things that we all do in trying to impress somebody or trying to reach out to somebody and failing, or they don't show interest, or they do and things are going good, but then something leads you to split up later, and all these different things were heavily being explored in that series, Watamote. And so when it comes to these characters, what really spurred on the idea of looking at characters that inspire me and that I feel relatable toward was talking about the currently unfolding series Gangsta and its two main sort of, protagonists, if you will, Nicholas Brown and Warwick Arcangelo, who suffered very much abuses as children. They eventually sort of came together, and, the series is still unfolding, so I don't know exactly how to consider them or how they consider each other. It's still kind of in question. They are very close-knit, and they're very much like brothers. They're very much concerned about each other, but there is also some, antagonistic qualities to it because of the way they came together. This is a world where people who have abilities and powers, that are fueled by medicinal drugs and things like that, that have been abused, and basically because they have these powers, they are seen, once again, touching on that vein of being outcast, being unaccepted. They are used as, when these characters are children, as slaves, and there are actually hunts against them to put them to death because people are afraid of how different they are. A great explorative commentary on how we react to people who are different, things that are different. It's something that burgeons fear within some of us, most of us, and it's those of us who sort of cast aside that fear and try to get to know each other and try to be compassionate and empathetic, that allows us to move forward. But here were these two children, one who had powers and had to compensate for that by being deaf and learning to communicate with others in a very limited fashion, and another who was just an average guy whose father was a drunkard, deadbeat, who was physically abusive to the point of taking a lit cigarette to his eye and making him lose one whole eye. While it's in the extreme, and much like the character Tomoko in the Watamote series, it's very much embellished in the extreme how bad their situation is. I am somebody who suffered abuses at the hand of a biological father in my life, in youth, that I only have vague memories of personally, but have heard, recordings of myself talking about it in the past and everything when those wounds were more fresh. And it's shocking, situations to sort of deal with in your day-to-day life. I think that's why I try to focus on the positives rather than the negatives, and only take, like the Spike character, things that are immediately going to affect my situation, and put any sort of focus on those things that can be cast aside, that I don't need to worry about, that would just add more pain to my situation. I cast aside because I've felt that pain. I felt tremendous pain emotionally, physically, in my youth as a result of these different properties, whether it be, as I say, being abused as a child like Nicholas and Warwick were, whether feeling the outcast, like a young Clark Kent or Superman and, Mr. Spock on the Enterprise, especially in his own youth. The more modern Star Trek films kind of explore this a little bit more, and we've gotten a little bit of it here and there, like Star Trek the Animated Series, for example, really shows a young Spock's plight. As the elder Spock has to go back, and there's a whole time travel thing going on where he has to help himself in youth to overcome an obstacle. But effectively, these are some of the characters that have strongly resonated with me because of those emotional torrential floods and physical floods, and characters as I would get older that, as I say, would look disdainfully at the world around me before I would come to a level of just not concerning myself with the things that would immediately affect me. I would be very much consumed with being hateful to the world that surrounded me and all the negatives and all the people who are just derogatory and destructive, whether it be harming others or harming themselves. I'm somebody, one of my strongest influences is Sherlock Holmes. I've read the entirety of the Sherlock Holmes canon as written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I've read spin-off novels and works and things like that. And while I don't even begin to pretend I'm in any way that intellect, that analytical, and all those kinds of things, the things that speak to me the most about Sherlock Holmes and that I most relate to are a level of observance of the grander picture, the grander design, being empathetic, being able to look at others and get a read of their character, and but also wanting to keep a critical mind. I'm not somebody because, for those of you who don't know, I refer to myself as being a laid-back straight edge. That means I'm not militant, I'm very carefree, I'm very laid back, but I don't wish to consume or interact with any sort of, artificial narcotic or alcohol or whatever that could very much, disparage my own health or make my mind less critical, less functioning. And that's something I've always admired in Sherlock Holmes, that he's, again, also calling over to Spock. These are characters who there's a level of emphasis on logic, of being critical and calculated in the way they look at the world and the way they consume the information that they take in. And these are things that I aspire toward in my own life. I want to have a critical mind, a calculating, very lucid viewpoint of the world around me, and be able to take that all in observance, as Sherlock Holmes might, and as Spock might, the more positive features, if you will, of that human condition, wanting to be able to appreciate the world for what it is and not focus on the negatives. And all of these characters in their various ways either afford me a look, back at the learning curve, the learning process that I went through at the times that I stumbled onto these characters, or they have afforded me in the now, perspective on where my mind is now, the way I look at the world, the way I interact with others. And there is a level of the Watamote character, Tomoko Kuroki, where I do close myself off from the world when I'm out and about, when I'm actually in the physical presence of others, because in observance of them, more often than not, I find people who just, without wanting to sound pompous, seem undesirable to me, not across the board, not in every case, but people who seem to look toward me judgmentally and maybe aren't as aware of the world around them and as accepting of the world around them, open-minded as I tend to be. Something, when I first came online, I was referring to myself as was kaleidoscopian. If I had to give myself sort of a spiritual, religious kind of, belief mindset, whatever like that, I preferred one of my own invention, kaleidoscopian, being somebody who sees through a prism the entire world around them and sort of observes everything and takes everything as it comes, and not really spends that much time focusing on wasteful, calls to the future or what might happen if and woulda, coulda, shoulda. What's right in front of me in the here and now, the person or people that I have on hand that I can interact with, and getting sort of a perspective on who they are, who I am, the things that benefit us in conversation, whether we have a debate or whether we agree about something. And each one of these characters, as I say, represents a period in my life from the past when I was a child all the way up to right now, here in the moment. And each of them, because of the effect they've had on me at the various times I've been introduced to them and stuck with them and revisited them, they sort of speak to where I am in my life, and why I keep going back, revisiting Cowboy Bebop, Watamote, Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, and all of its various other incarnations and forms, from the manga to the films to the OVAs, novels, Sherlock Holmes, films and novels, of course the films, The Time Machine and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and almost anything Superman, especially the TV series Smallville, which I could highly relate to being a teenager in school and being like Clark Kent, feeling like an outsider, having things about my personality, mostly geeky things, being creative, being an artist and, an aspiring writer, and having crushes on girls and just not being able to get up the courage to approach them for fear of them not understanding or accepting who I was and the way I was and how I was and all these different things and what made me who I am. And to a degree, through the course of my life, I won't say it's a hurdle that I've entirely leapt beyond, but I found much more beneficial sort of, an outlook on myself. I've accepted myself to the point where I don't obsess anymore. I don't, gauge who I am based upon the way other people see me, and I don't really care about that anymore. While I do still have the agonizing anxiety in wanting to approach women I find attractive and such like that. I mean, it's one of those things where that's still the learning curve. That's still finding the courage to break beyond that is still an exploration for me personally in this world. But with characters like this, to be invested in, to be inspired, and have affirmation in just the interaction of my reading their exploits or watching their exploits and adventures, misadventures, and the like. There are so many different things in the fictional universe and fictional characters that we can find to sort of help us better, formulate how we're going to live our lives and how to approach the lives we're going to be living and the choices we want to make. And I always, above all, with all of these characters, I take note of the mistakes in my own life that these characters have experienced. I use them as part of that learning curve to try to hopefully, propel an evolution in myself as much as these characters sometimes go through, from the start of a story to the end of a story. And that can be anything from actual growth and, sort of emotional evolution to go beyond whatever's holding you back. It could be from birth to death. All of these different things I find highly fascinating. And these are just some of the characters that do it for me. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below, or as video response, very much would be welcome. Any characters that you have ever felt strongly connected to or strongly you related with, their plight or their journey or aspects of their character. I think it would be a fun discussion to have. So otherwise, it'll be pretty much it for me on this. I hope this video finds you well. I'll catch you all later. Peace.